It all began 3 million years ago, in a time when humans were nothing more than primitive apes ruling the wilderness. Among them was the protagonist of our story, an unremarkable Australopithecus with an unusually strong passion for hunting. However, what truly set him apart wasn't his skill or drive, it was his immortality. While his companions turned to dust with the passing millennia, he remained a constant observer of time's unrelenting flow. As eons passed, the world changed, but he endured. With an eternal life stretching before him, he devoted himself to the thrill of hunting, the art of combat, and the endless pursuit of stronger prey. What began as survival gradually transformed into an obsession. To him, hunting was no longer just a way of life, it was his identity, his purpose, and his ultimate joy. 3 million years of this relentless pursuit forged him into an unparalleled force. His strength, cultivated through endless battles, grew so immense that he transcended mortal limits and ascended to the realm of the gods. Once a mere ape, he was now Mu, the supreme god, the highest-ranked deity in the divine realm. Yet, despite achieving the pinnacle of existence, Mu found himself dissatisfied. One day, overcome with boredom, protagonist tapped his toe against the ground. This small, thoughtless gesture sent tremors rippling through the land beneath him. The land he rested on was the divine realm itself, a sanctuary for gods, and his casual actions sent shockwaves that disturbed even the farthest reaches. Among the countless deities in the sanctuary, none were more frustrated than Lucifer, the god of Elmer, who ranked second after protagonist. He knew exactly who was responsible for the quake and fumed in irritation. Meanwhile, protagonist slouched on his throne, his expression soured by his own thoughts. The realization that he had fought and defeated every rival worth challenging weighed heavily on him. Centuries had passed since his last real battle, and the memory of it had grown faint. Protagonist, it seemed, had reached a paradox of power. He was so strong that no one could challenge him, and he was utterly bored. But then, an idea struck him. If no worthy opponent existed, perhaps he could create one by deliberately lowering his own strength. With newfound excitement, protagonist devised a plan to leave the divine realm and possess the body of a human on Earth. There, he could experience challenges anew, starting from the bottom. Wasting no time, he summoned his loyal companion and secretary, Yongyong. Yongyong, a massive and imposing reptilian creature, appeared instantly at his master's command. As the supreme god's closest attendant, his name translated directly to dragon in human tongues. Seeing protagonist's expression, Yongyong sensed trouble and asked what his master was planning. Protagonist casually explained his intention to descend to Earth and possess a human body. Hearing this, Yongyong's face paled in alarm. Without hesitation, he cast an absolute binding spell, chaining his master in place. "Master, you can't be serious!" Yongyong cried. "The Gods' Council meeting is soon, and you have responsibilities to fulfill." But protagonist barely acknowledged the chains or his secretary's protests. With a lazy shrug, dragging the massive reptile along as though the bindings were made of paper, Yongyong struggled to hold him back, but his resistance was futile. The real reason for Yongyong's panic wasn't just protagonist's abandonment of his duties, it was his own self-preservation. Yongyong knew all too well that once his master left, the other gods, seething with resentment and grudges toward protagonist, would take out their frustrations on him instead. Despite Yongyong's desperate attempts to reason with him, protagonist had already made up his mind. Effortlessly, he shattered the binding spell and turned to his secretary with a smirk. "Fight me, and I'll consider staying," protagonist said. Of course, the idea of being obliterated by his own master was the last thing Yongyong wanted. Defeated, he nervously wished protagonist a safe journey instead. With no obstacles left, Mu began scanning the minds of humans on Earth, searching for a suitable vessel. As he tuned into the cacophony of human thoughts, one in particular caught his attention, a desperate wish from a young man who yearned to leave his world behind and be reborn in another. Protagonist grinned. This was perfect. Not only would he find a vessel, but he'd also grant the human's wish as a bonus. It was a win-win situation. Turning to Yongyong, protagonist gave one final instruction. "Take care of my body while I'm gone." Yongyong froze in panic. "Master, if your soul leaves your body and something happens to it, you'll perish." But protagonist was unmoved. With a dismissive wave, he brushed off Yongyong's concerns and promised to return soon. Meanwhile, on Earth, a 17-year-old named Li Ho was reaching the end of his rope. An ordinary boy with no real prospects, Li found solace only in video games, where he could imagine himself as the main character. But even that escape had grown hollow. Tired of his unremarkable life, Li had made up his mind to end end it. Standing on the edge, he cursed the gods, daring them to do something, anything, to change his fate. With a deep breath, he jumped, hoping that death might grant him the chance to start anew in another world. As he plummeted, Lee's mind filled with a mix of regret and hope. Finally, he hit the ground with a sickening thud, his body broken. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer alone. Standing before him was a towering, beastly figure that exuded an overwhelming presence. Lee's heart raced as he stared at the creature. Both Lee and Yong, who had followed protagonist's departing soul, asked in unison, "Who the hell are you?" As the protagonist possessed Lee Ho's body a mere second before it hit the ground, the inevitable impact rendered the body a bloody, broken mess. The protagonist could barely move his limbs, but instead of despair, his mind buzzed with intrigue. Before he did anything further, he took a moment to assess the state of the body and reflect on the nature of involuntary muscles that operate without conscious control. The heart, along with the muscles of internal organs, falls into this category. However, the protagonist, who had spent 3 million years honing his mastery over the physical body, had achieved a pinnacle understanding of the human form. Unlike ordinary beings, he could consciously control every part of his vessel, including blood vessels and even the so-called involuntary muscles. With this unparalleled control, the protagonist repaired the heart of the dying body by manipulating its blood vessels. He stopped the bleeding and stabilized the organs. As blood loss slowed and the body began to mend under his careful attention, he found himself exhilarated by the sensation. It had been so long since he'd experienced the raw, visceral feeling of his own blood leaving his veins. A proud grin spread across his face. Yes, this was the right decision. Coming to Earth, inhabiting a mortal body, this was exactly the kind of challenge he'd been craving. Once stable, he decided his first stop should be Lee Ho's residence. After dragging the battered body back to the dorm, the protagonist spent hours digging through the fragments of Lee Ho's memories. He pieced together the young man's life. Lee Ho had only one family member, a male relative who lived far away. In simple terms, Lee Ho lived alone, poor and miserable. His occupation? Attending a place called school. As the protagonist sifted through more memories, he stumbled upon the image of a particular individual, a brute who frequently beat Lee Ho to a pulp under the flimsiest of pretenses. Instead of feeling anger, the protagonist's grin widened. The idea of having a ready-made rival was thrilling. Fighting was the entire purpose of his visit to this planet, and now he had someone to test himself against. Just as he was hyping himself up for the battles to come, a sharp pain flared in his muscles. He quickly identified the cause: muscle soreness from the handstand he'd performed earlier. The aching sensation coursed through his limbs like fire, but far from discouraging him, it only fueled his excitement. It had been eons since he'd felt something so utterly human, so perfectly mortal. The next day, the site where Lee Ho's body had fallen caught the attention of authorities. With so much blood on the ground, they quickly turned it into a restricted crime zone. The protagonist noticed the gathered officers but had no interest in drawing attention to himself just yet. He veered off the path toward his new destination, school. Upon arriving, the protagonist approached the classroom door and opened it with far too much force. The door rebounded and smacked him squarely in the face. Staggering slightly, he entered the room, drawing the attention of the students. One face, in particular, stood out, the brute from Lee Ho's memories. The bully took note of the protagonist's presence and immediately mocked him. "What's with that stupid grin, loser?" The protagonist's grin only widened as recognition dawned. This was the very bastard who had tormented Lee Ho. The sight of his prey, served to him on a golden platter, filled him with euphoria. The bully, annoyed by the grinning, put his phone down and threw a punch without warning. The impact caused the protagonist's face to bleed, but he didn't react, standing still and unfazed. You see, the protagonist had his own rules for fighting. A fight only truly began when all participants had a shared will to fight. The opponent's intent was key, and the only way to confirm it was by enduring their preemptive attack. Despite the blow, the protagonist was elated. The green light had been given. With no hesitation, he delivered a devastating punch to the bully's face. The sheer force of the blow sent shockwaves through the protagonist's arm, reigniting the soreness in his muscles. The pain was so intense it contorted his face, making him look as if he'd just eaten something foul. The classroom erupted in chaos. The teacher, furious, shouted at the two of them, but the bully wasn't done. Embarrassed and enraged, he lunged at the protagonist with renewed determination. The protagonist readied himself, but in his weakened state, his body lacked the strength to react as it normally would. Unable to dodge, he braced for impact, taking another hard blow. It was then that the protagonist discovered something horrifying. There was no mana on Earth. The bully prepared another punch, and the protagonist knew he was running out of options. His current body wasn't strong enough to withstand prolonged fighting. Still, he steeled himself, choosing to face the attack head-on. As the bully's fist came flying, the protagonist used the only weapon than he had left his head. He lowered his skull into the path of the punch, and the resulting crack of bone on bone sent a jolt through the classroom. The bully's knuckles shattered on impact, leaving him howling in agony. While his opponent was reeling, the protagonist took advantage of the opening and delivered a brutal headbutt straight to the solar plexus, the weakest point of the human torso. The bully doubled over, winded and disoriented, but the protagonist wasn't finished. With one final move, he delivered an upward headbutt to the bully's chin, knocking him to the ground. The classroom fell silent, except for the sound of phones recording the scene. The students stared in shock at the sight of Lee Ho, yesterday's punching bag, standing victorious. As for the protagonist, he was utterly lost in the euphoria of the fight. He reveled in the dull pain throbbing in his muscles, the bitter taste of blood in his mouth, and the rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in millennia, and it was everything he'd hoped for. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the protagonist felt truly alive. The protagonist crouched down, his gaze steady as he prepared to express his gratitude to the bully. But the protagonist's way of showing gratitude was unlike anything anyone could have imagined. Without hesitation, he opened his mouth, bit off the bully's ear, and spat it onto the ground with barbaric indifference. The shocking act left everyone in stunned silence, their anxiety deepening tenfold. To think that someone could rip off another's ear so casually, it was a sight that no one present would ever forget. But for the protagonist, this was his twisted way of leaving a mark on those who managed to give him a fun fight. It was his peculiar version of gratitude, branding his opponent as a toy that could bring him joy in the future. From this day forward, anyone marked by the protagonist in this manner would be known as the protagonist's play. To him, only strong opponents could provide the thrill of a worthy battle, so in his eyes, being one of the protagonist's play was a symbol of strength. However, on Earth, things didn't work that way. Such a violent custom naturally earned him scorn and fear. Even students from other classes were buzzing about what had happened. Fights between students weren't anything new, but someone being maimed like this, that was unheard of. Through the windows, students watched as the bully was loaded into an ambulance. The sight of the bloodied figure being taken away in a stretcher only added fuel to the rumors spreading like wildfire. The protagonist, on the other hand, seemed entirely unbothered. In fact, he was pleased. He even waved the ambulance off cheerfully, glad that this world had such a convenient house call treatment system. But his victory was short-lived. Standing behind him was his furious teacher, face red with anger. Once they were in the office, the teacher didn't hold back, berating the protagonist with all the fury of someone pushed to their limit. The teacher was so angry, in fact, that he instinctively raised his hand, ready to strike. The protagonist, instead of flinching, grew visibly excited. He wanted the teacher to hit him. The mere thought of receiving a blow thrilled him. But when the teacher saw the glint of eagerness in the protagonist's eyes, he froze, hand trembling in midair. Realizing it was pointless to argue with this madman, the teacher sighed, lowered his hand, and dismissed the protagonist, ordering him to bring his parents the next day. Dismissed early, the protagonist left the school, his mood visibly dampened. He hadn't had enough fighting, and being sent home early felt like a punishment. But at least it gave him time to recover from the injuries he'd sustained. If only he could use mana, it would have been a game changer. Mana, the life force that existed in other worlds, was called by many names: chi, chakra, or simply mana. In some realms, humans used it to become hunters or wizards, but on Earth there was no mana. That meant no magic, no skills, and no way for the protagonist to draw upon the immense powers he was used to wielding. He tried once more to summon mana, but the attempt proved futile. With no other choice, he resolved to rely solely on his physical strength. Shrugging off his frustration, the protagonist decided to return to God's sanctuary and rest until his body healed. When he arrived, however, he was greeted by an unusual sight. Lee Ho was choking the life out of poor Yong-Yong, the protagonist's dragon companion. Annoyed, the protagonist conjured a massive hand and grabbed Lee Ho with ease, lifting him off the ground. Lee Ho protested, declaring his desire to take Yong-Yong to another world. With a dragon by his side, he believed he'd become invincible. But the protagonist paid him no mind. Instead, he made his intentions clear. Lee Ho was going to another world, whether he liked it or not. A while later, the protagonist barged into Lucifer's domain unannounced. Lucifer, the second-ranked god, immediately understood why the protagonist was there and flatly refused to help. But the protagonist wasn't one to take no for an answer. Lucifer reminded him of the divine rules. Interfering in another god's domain was forbidden. Breaking those rules would activate a defensive barrier, making any further actions impossible. But the protagonist, as always, ignored the warnings. With brute force, he shattered the barrier, leaving Lucifer speechless. Dropping Lee Ho onto the ground, the protagonist instructed him to step through the portal to another world. Lee Ho hesitated, unwilling to go without Yong-Yong. The protagonist, however, bluntly refused, stating that Yongyong belonged to him. Flicking Liho toward the portal with his giant hand, the protagonist sent him hurtling into the unknown. With his task complete, the protagonist turned to leave, but not before leaving Lucifer seething with rage. Lucifer had once been the supreme ruler of his own domain, a being so powerful he had slain God and claimed their throne. But now, faced with the protagonist, even he was powerless. As the protagonist hopped onto Yongyong to depart, a massive, ominous eye appeared in the sky, silently watching his every move. Let's take another look at Lucifer, who is as red as a tomato with all the anger bubbling inside him. Now let's switch back to that bully whose face creepily resembles an angry Lucifer. He's absolutely annoyed after getting his ass handed to him by a so-called pathetic loser. Though he's not about to let Liho off the hook so easily, especially after getting humiliated like that. It's just against his pride. To take revenge, he decides to call in his ace up his sleeve, Kong Chiol. Enter Kong Chiol. He's a jack dude and the 11th National Sports Festival Youth Division boxing middleweight champion. As he pours sweat in the gym, a ringing phone in the locker room suddenly catches his attention. It turns out the phone isn't his, it's his friend Gok Chiol's phone. Gok has 2 years of boxing experience under his belt along with 14 sparring sessions. Gok picks up his cracked phone and answers the call. And of course, the caller is none other than that jerk bully. By the way, I still don't know the bully's name, so let's give him a well-deserved nickname. Chicken. Chicken offers Gok a new phone to replace his broken one, but in exchange, there's something he wants in return. Well, you know how it goes. Gok is more than willing to help Chicken with whatever it is. The next scene transitions into the classroom. Chicken enters, his nose and ears still covered in bandages, with his hand also wrapped up. After that humiliating loss in front of everyone, he can barely walk into the classroom with his head held high. As expected, he becomes the center of attention, and the students immediately start clamoring about how he ended up like this. After always picking on people, they find it hilarious how the once tough guy is now nothing more than a defeated mess. The students who used to be scared of him now think it's ridiculous that they were ever intimidated by this hobo. Eventually, all these insults get under Chicken's skin. Slamming his bag down in sheer frustration, he glares at everyone. He confronts the students who are intentionally whispering just loud enough for him to hear. He challenges all of them openly, and dares them to face him head-on if they're so eager to pick a fight. While most of the students recoil in fear, one particular student, the class president, stands up from her seat without hesitation. She tells him to shut the hell up and sit down, or, if he doesn't like it, he can leave the class. Chicken can't stand the fact that he used to be the hotshot in this room, but now everyone treats him like a complete loser. In a fit of rage, he grabs a chair and yells out a challenge to the entire class, daring anyone to come at him if they're so eager. It's then that a jacked-up guy steps into the classroom. Once he's inside, he questions the loudmouth about why he's standing. Chicken doesn't take long to slump back into his seat. While Chicken cowers in his seat, the class president gives a quick nod to the teacher, silently assuring that everything is fine. The teacher, however, has other plans. He asks the class president to meet him after school. Apparently, the guy who caused the scene yesterday, Li Ho, hasn't been answering his phone. The teacher wants the class president to check on him. To sweeten the deal, he promises her a glowing recommendation letter for her senior year. With that, the teacher conveniently dumps his responsibility onto the poor girl and heads out. Later, the class president arrives at the hostel building. She knocks on the door for what feels like ages, but there's no response. Since no one is answering her calls either, she decides to take matters into her own hands and enters the room. The moment she steps inside, two things immediately grab her attention. First, there are cockroaches crawling around everywhere. Second, and far more concerning, the man she's looking for is sprawled out on the floor, his eyes rolled back in his head. Her heart races, and panic sets in. For a moment, she genuinely believes she's staring at a corpse. Later, we see that Liho's body has been escorted to the hospital. Right at that moment, the protagonist returns to the body. After finding himself in a completely different place than where he last left the body, the protagonist is naturally curious about his surroundings. As he tries to sit up, he notices he's connected to a drip. Since he does not understand the concept of injections or IVs, he feels dubious about the strange sensation of fluid entering his veins. He focuses on it and soon realizes the fluid contains nutrients that are being absorbed rapidly, helping to speed up his recovery. It's not exactly magic, but whatever this thing is, it's undeniably effective. The thought that even Earth has something as useful as this brings a smile to his face. However, his subtle snickering catches the class president's attention, and it only creeps her out. She then explains that the homeroom teacher instructed her to find him. Now that her mission is successful, she plans to head back. Meanwhile, the protagonist has a lot of questions he wants answered, so he quickly requests her to wait for a moment, so he can ask her a few things. She acknowledges his call and stops upon his insistence, giving him a short period of her time before she proceeds to head to the tuition. Well, it looks like the protagonist has some questions that could help him learn about this world. The most important thing this fight-obsessed brute wants to know is if there's any place where he can train his body. The girl is completely expressionless, unsure how to respond since his question came totally out of the blue and was completely unexpected. But after a moment of thought, she decides to guide him. Since the protagonist is broke as hell, he ends up in a public park instead of a jam-packed gym. After doing some pull-ups, the protagonist feels pretty good. Even though he's just in an ordinary park with basic training equipment, he finds it all incredibly professional compared to what he had back 4,000 years ago. Back in the day, the only exercise he did was stone rolling, cliff climbing, and digging holes. It was all simple, primitive training methods. But looking at this modern equipment, he's forced to admit that Earthlings are tougher than he originally thought. Suddenly, a pebble strikes him out of nowhere. It turns out Chicken has shown up, and he's brought along Gawk, the friend he hired. Chicken is drenched in sweat, his face contorted like he's dealing with some serious constipation. He's been searching the whole neighborhood for the protagonist, and of all places, this is where he finally finds him. Meanwhile, the protagonist picks up the pebble from the ground, trying to figure out who had the nerve to tag him with that thing. Chicken, in a not-so-bright move, admits it was him. He immediately follows up with a threat, bragging that the protagonist's days are numbered because his cousin took out all the third years single-handedly. But before Chicken can finish running his mouth, the protagonist lands a punch so devastating that it sends him straight to the ground. You see, to the protagonist, that pebble counted as a preemptive attack, which was more than enough justification to start the fight. The scene transitions to the god's sanctuary, where all the gods are gathered around a grand round table for a regular meeting. However, instead of the protagonist, Yongyong has taken the seat to represent his master, holding a written speech in hand. Yongyong begins the meeting, prepared to act as a messenger on behalf of his god. Things take a sharp turn when the absolutely livid Lucifer interrupts, demanding to know what in the actual hell Yongyong is doing there. The poor dragon nearly jumps out of his scales in shock. In a panic, he scrambles to reassure Lucifer that he's only there to deliver a message and will leave right after. After this frantic explanation, Yongyong gathers himself and proceeds to deliver the message. The message is simple, perhaps too simple. It states that the protagonist is looking forward to fighting someone stronger than himself and asks to be notified immediately if such a person shows up. Unsurprisingly, Lucifer is beyond annoyed by this nonsense. He slams the table so hard in frustration that a crack forms along its surface. Still fuming, he vents his frustration aloud. These meetings are already a colossal waste of his time, and now the protagonist can't even be bothered to show up in person. Lucifer turns to the other gods, questioning if they're really okay with this kind of insincere behavior from the protagonist. A heavy silence falls over everyone, making it painfully clear that, no, they're not okay with it, but at the same time, there's nothing they can do about it, at least not right now. That's when a blue-haired god, the third-rank deity and divine archer Su, speaks up. She reminds everyone that these meetings are meant to ensure world stability. When an abnormality arises that even the heart god can't handle, everyone is supposed to step in and deal with it. However, she finds it disappointing, if not outright disrespectful, that the protagonist didn't even bother showing up. Lucifer, already a ticking bomb, erupts again. He roars that the real issue is how maintaining the world seems like nothing more than a game to the protagonist. He warns that the entire system could collapse with the reckless way the protagonist keeps acting on his whims. To make matters worse, the protagonist's so-called solutions always end up making things worse. His anger peaks as he recalls the disaster from 1,000 years ago involving planet Cyclops. Just thinking about it sends his rage into overdrive. The god of Cyclops quickly nods along, visibly uncomfortable as he recalls that catastrophe from 1,000 years ago. By the way, he's the 8th-ranked god. Here's a little context about what happened back then on planet Cyclops. Apparently, a void creature, Shaggoth, attacked the planet. While the protagonist, the maniac, obliterated the monster with his brute strength, his recklessness caused colossal damage to the planet itself. Lucifer firmly believes that if the gods had worked together, they could have minimized the destruction. Instead, the protagonist botched the whole thing, allowing the creature to devour part of the planet before taking it down. Lucifer is done tolerating this. He declares that he can no longer watch that lunatic destroy everything in his path. Without hesitation, he goes so far as to claim that the protagonist isn't even fit to hold the title of a god. Hearing this, Yongyong panics. The poor reptile can only watch as the god's resentment toward the protagonist becomes glaringly obvious. With nothing else in his power, all he can do is fighters desperately beg for his master to return and fix things. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Chicken is sprawled on the ground after that punch. He's furious, seething at the thought that this idiot didn't even hesitate before decking him, even though his esteemed cousin, the boxer, is standing right there. Gok Chio finally speaks up. He can tell this kid not only has guts but also knows how to throw a punch or two. Curiously, he asks the protagonist if he plays any sports. Of course, this brute has no concept of something as structured as sports, and simply states that all he does is fight. Gok Chio nearly chokes on his own breath hearing this clown of a response. But whatever the case, his curiosity is piqued. He's ready to test the protagonist's mettle and throw a punch or two at him. He takes the liberty to strike first and launches a brutal punch. The result is just as you would expect. Blood sprays from the protagonist's nose, and he's sent sprawling backward. This outcome doesn't make Gok Chio happy in the slightest. He's utterly bewildered, realizing that the protagonist had deliberately watched his punch all the way through and didn't even try to dodge it. Let me remind you, the protagonist, the maniac, doesn't dodge preemptive strikes. Now that the stage is set, our guy is ready to go all out. After observing Gok Chio's movements, the protagonist mimics a boxer's stance. Balling up his fist, he throws a punch with all his might, but Gok Chio quickly dodges the blow. Though the sheer force of the punch sends him skidding backward, the poor guy learns the hard way that this dude, Lee Ho, really has something in him. The power behind that punch was downright unreal. The protagonist, on the other hand, is having the time of his life. Throwing a proper boxing punch for the first time felt like absolute bliss. At the moment of impact, the protagonist had intentionally tensed his arm muscles as hard as he could. Sure, his arm is screaming in pain now, but it was worth it. That punch felt amazing. He's never experienced this kind of force before, especially not from those weaklings who would break the moment he touched them. Still, if he wants to keep fighting, he knows he needs to take better care of his body. For now, he decides to use a temporary fix in the form of hants. Hants are ancient Greek boxing straps made from 4 long strips of tanned cowhide, wrapped tightly around the wrists for support. Meanwhile, Chicken is losing his mind watching his cousin, the so-called boxer, get pushed back. He angrily questions Gok Chio, demanding to know why he's struggling so much against this nobody. Under the mounting pressure, Gok Chio launches himself forward again, aiming to land another punch, but the protagonist quickly safeguards himself, effortlessly blocking the attack. Gok Chio, on the other hand, is gritting his teeth in frustration. He's throwing everything he has, yet this guy is just standing there, stopping all his punches as if it's nothing. The protagonist, on the other hand, is analyzing every move. He knows how fast and precise Gok Chio's punches are, but they're way too predictable. Just watching the way his muscles move, the protagonist can tell exactly where each punch is aimed. Finally, the protagonist takes a calculated step back, effortlessly avoiding a direct hit. Gok Chio gets frustrated after having his blow dodged, so he quickly throws another punch, but the protagonist dodges that one too. Then my guy counters with a perfectly placed punch to Gok Chio's hand, causing him agonizing pain. The protagonist finds it funny when he notices how Gok Chio's pained reaction is quite similar to Chicken's expression. If he had any doubts before, they're gone now. These two are definitely cousins. With another decisive blow, the protagonist knocks Gok Chio out cold, leaving Chicken standing there, frozen in fear under the protagonist's intense gaze. While the protagonist is eager to finish what they started, Chicken can only tremble, his courage completely drained. Seeing Chicken cowering in fear, the protagonist concludes that he has lost the will to fight. He directly asks if this bastard plans to fight further, but before Chicken can muster a response, the protagonist delivers a devastating punch straight to his face. What follows is a relentless flurry of blows. The protagonist doesn't give Chicken even a second to concede defeat. Blow after blow lands, and by the end of it, Chicken is beaten to a pulp. To finish things off, the protagonist delivers one final bone-rattling punch, knocking Chicken out for good. Satisfied that his opponent has no fight left, the protagonist turns and walks away after claiming the ear of Gok Chio, leaving the two broken cousins behind. Later, the protagonist returns to his apartment. Sitting there and reflecting on the recent events, he admits that fighting has been fun so far, but the fact that his body breaks so easily is holding him back a lot. He never, even in his wildest imagination, thought that his muscles would tear just from throwing a few simple blows. While this muscle-tearing process is crucial for growing stronger and continuing to fight, it constantly interrupts him. He eventually decides to head back to the god's sanctuary to retrieve something he had asked Yong to prepare, a recovery magic orb. However, when he tries to return to the sanctuary, he fails. No matter how hard he concentrates, the transition just doesn't happen, leaving him wondering what in the world is going on. To understand the situation, let's rewind a few days to the Divine Realm, the domain of Elmore under the god Lucifer's charge. This was when the protagonist had forcefully tossed Li Ho into Lucifer's world. Before leaving, the protagonist had told Yong to try and procure a recovery magic orb if possible. These orbs, it turns out, are special magical items often found on planets rich in mana like Elmore. They're common on such worlds, casually used for healing and recovery. But Earth, being a planet with scarce mana, only has these orbs through divine blessings or the whims of the gods. As a result, they're exceedingly rare on Earth, and only a select few humans throughout history have ever possessed them. Those who did were revered as gods by the rest of humanity. Yong promises to prepare what his master requested before returning, but curiously asks who will attend the regular meetings if the protagonist is going to leave. In response, the protagonist rummages through his pants and pulls out a piece of paper containing the speech the dragon is supposed to deliver. With that, his master leaves. Meanwhile, Lucifer has been keeping a close watch with his giant eye. In the present, there's only one thought on Lucifer's mind: the protagonist's body is currently empty. Since the protagonist didn't join the meeting, it means he's planning to stay away for longer. This is a golden opportunity Lucifer doesn't want to lose. In fact, it's a once-in-a-thousand-years opportunity. Without hesitation, Lucifer quickly uses one of his spells and summons purple rods, letting them crash down. But Yong quickly dodges the attack, sternly questioning Lucifer about what he's trying to pull. With a firm tone, the dragon inquires if this is perhaps a declaration of war against the Earth God. Lucifer rises into the air, making it clear that he will expel the Earth God from the seat of divinity. It's a war, and he intends to win. With this declaration, Yong doesn't try to hold back either. He quickly opens his maw, preparing a compressed breath fire attack, and shoots a beam of fire at Lucifer. But Lucifer casually flings the attack away like it's nothing. The attack literally spans 360 degrees of the entire planet and causes a massive explosion. The explosion is so enormous that even Soso has to activate her self-defense aura, casting it over all the other gods to protect them from the collateral damage. After that massive attack, Yong decides to take things up a notch. He activates his polymorph release ability, and the guy grows to a massive size. Compared to him, Lucifer looks like a tiny mosquito. But as we all know, size doesn't matter. What truly matters is stamina, and it's no surprise that someone as big as Yong eventually gets outmatched. Soso looks tired already, and since she doesn't want to be part of this mess, she starts to leave. But Lucifer quickly stops her before she leaves. He wants to know where she stands, whether she supports the protagonist or opposes him. But Soso doesn't want to choose sides, so she decides to remain neutral. Lucifer, however, doesn't care if she stays neutral as long as she stays out of the way. He turns to the others and tells them to step forward if anyone opposes this idea. If anyone wants to oppose him, he's more than ready to handle them himself. Yong then speaks up, questioning Lucifer's audacity to think he can actually defeat Master Protagonist. Lucifer sneers in response, confident that the protagonist with that weak earthling body couldn't do jacks. Yong grows concerned when he realizes that Lucifer already knows this. Lucifer reminds the dragon that complacency in strength and neglecting vigilance will lead to the protagonist's downfall. But Yong isn't about to let Lucifer have his way. He quickly retaliates with his giant tail, but Lucifer slices through it with his sword as easily as cutting through a cucumber. Severely injured, the poor dragon is left wounded, but Lucifer makes it clear that as long as Yong is alive, he can still reach Earth, and once there, he'll make sure to destroy the protagonist while he's in his weakened state. Yong laughs out loud at Lucifer's words, mocking the idea that this bastard stands a chance. The scene transitions to Gok Cheol, who has just come out of the nursery after being patched up in the gym. He's getting an earful from his senior. His senior does not like the fact that this punk ended up badly injured and now wants to quit fighting even though the competition is just around the corner. The poor guy can do nothing but apologize, but his apologies don't calm his senior down. The senior instructs him not to come back until his arm is healed and dismisses him, telling him to get out of his sight. After taking the harsh words, the poor guy begins to walk out. As he leaves, he runs into Kong Cheol at the exit. Kong, of course, is not thrilled to see his friend in such a beaten-up state and questions him about the broken arm. Now that Gok thinks about it, Kong is the best boxer in their gym, so he wonders if he might be able to defeat the person who did this. He bows his head in embarrassment before starting to explain. He claims that Chicken was getting bullied, so he stepped up to save him, but the opposing party ganged up on him and beat him up. What a coward. He literally twisted the entire story just to save his face. He is lying that he was ganged up on instead of admitting that he was soloed by the protagonist. Anyway, Gok claims that his left arm and ear are in this condition because of those punks. He even starts crying in order to sway Kong into fighting those bastards for him. But it seems Kong isn't as stupid or brain-dead as this blonde. Kong simply tells him that he should have been more careful before the competition, and instead of fighting, he could should have done an extra sparring session. Of course, Gawk wasn't expecting this response. The fact that Kong isn't even considering helping him just makes him a little annoyed. Suddenly Kong pauses, turns around with a totally pissed off face, and asks this idiot who it was that beat him to a pulp. Now let's switch back to the protagonist. After trying to teleport himself several times, he once again fails to return. This is something very strange, to say the least. There's only one scenario in which he wouldn't be able to return. The first scenario is when the original body is damaged, but the protagonist is sure his body is supposed to be protected by Yong-Yong. And even if it wasn't Yong-Yong who damaged the body, there aren't many things that could harm it. That's when a realization dawns on him. He entertains the idea that perhaps all the gods have joined forces to attack him. He feels annoyed to think that out of all the times, this is when they chose to challenge him. He desperately wants to fight them, but he's not sure how to do it while he's stuck here. After punching the poor pillow into oblivion, the protagonist tries once again to calm himself down. Even if all the gods attacked him at once, he's confident that Yong-Yong wouldn't go down so easily. Still, the protagonist can't afford to just sit around and do nothing, so he decides to do what he can for now. The next day, we find him once again in the park where he's back at his strength training. Right now, his main goal is to focus on strengthening muscles other than his arms. He can feel the strain in muscles he doesn't normally use, and though they scream in pain, the sensation is quite thrilling. The more he pushes himself, the more he enjoys it. His laughter echoes through the park as he revels in this moment of rapture. Onlookers nearby are left utterly bewildered, witnessing this strange dude enjoying himself in such an odd, almost unsettling way. After this rigorous training session, his legs finally give out and he collapses. This is when he notices the class president, who looks less than pleased to see him here. She asks him somewhat sharply why he's not attending school. Later, they both sit down, and he initiates the conversation by questioning her on why it's so important for him to be in school, especially since it's not really the place for body training. She asks him what his plan is. Then he simply replies that he just wants to get stronger, and that's the only reason he's training. The president then asks another daunting question. Why does he want to get stronger? He explains that it's so he can fight better since, right now, he's too weak to fight at all. His body is completely untrained, and he needs to build it up. His arms are already in bad shape, even though he's only been in a few fights. With strength training at the gym, he can build endurance, and if he gets stronger, he'll be able to fight longer and possibly more than once, and eventually more than twice. His body will also move better. Hearing this guy ramble on about training non-stop is starting to make the girl feel nauseous. He's been going on for hours, and she's not sure how she's supposed to get this maniac to come to school. Then an idea clicks in her mind. She asks him why he is bothering to train if there's no one to fight. She reminds him that he's just working out alone with no one around to challenge him. He needs to meet people, stir up some conflict, and only then will he find someone to fight. Before leaving, she instructs him to start coming to school regularly starting tomorrow, and to stop making her put up with more of his nonsense. As she walks away, he starts to see the logic behind her words. It's true that the guys he beat up probably won't show up again, so he'll need to find stronger opponents on his own. And looking for someone to fight while waiting for his body to recover doesn't sound like such a bad idea. While he's still deciding whether or not to start going to school tomorrow, a shady guy sneaks up behind him and calls out his name. He quickly picks up on the guy's tone and lets out a heavy sigh, feeling a sense of satisfaction. It seems like he's finally found his next target. As the punch comes flying at him, the maniac turns around with a big smile, ready to take it right to the face. If you're excited for the next part, leave a comment, and I'll do my best to bring it to you as soon as possible.